Hello, everyone that just joined. Thanks for joining the First Amendment Museum tonight for Waging a Good War with author Thomas E. Ricks. This is the latest chapter of our online speaker series. So if this is your first time joining us, the First Amendment Museum is a nonpartisan nonprofit located in Augusta, Maine. I'm Max Nospish, the manager of visitor experiences at the First Amendment Museum. We do rely on gifts from viewers like you, whether you're watching this live or if you're watching a recording of this later on our website or on YouTube. We rely on donations from the viewers like you. And if you enjoyed this presentation and you would like to see more, please consider donating to us. I'll provide that link in the chat after this. And check out our website for future speaker series installments, other events, film screenings, along with other great content and opportunities. In fact, we've hosted Mr. Ricks before, and we have his presentation on our website and YouTube channel, so check that out. Tonight's guest, Thomas E. Ricks, is a writer and a military history columnist for the New York Times Book Review. Ricks covered the U.S. military for the Washington Post from 2000 until 2008. Until the end of 1999, he had the same beat at the Wall Street Journal, where he was a reporter for 17 years. He reported on U.S. military activities in Somalia, Haiti, Korea, Bosnia, Kosovo, Macedonia, Kuwait, Turkey, Afghanistan, and Iraq. He is the author of 8 books. His best known is Fiasco, the American Military Adventure in Iraq, 2003 to 2005, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in 2007. He truly is the perfect person to have written, as he calls it, a military history of the civil rights movement, which we're going to hear about today. If you have any questions for Tom, I have on good authority to just jump in and ask. Just put them in the chat and I can go ahead and I'll stop Tom and I say, Tom, we have a question. You're watching on Facebook, just put those questions in the Facebook comments and we can just sort of puncture Tom's presentation with those questions. We get a good dialogue going. So Tom, thanks for joining us. Glad to have you.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for that kind introduction. And I want to key right off of it. One of the big questions people had for me with this book is, why would you write a military history of the civil rights movement? That is to say, the military is about the use of force, whereas the civil rights movement was about nonviolence. What could a military perspective possibly tell you? My answer is quite a lot. The civil rights movement had a lot in common with the military. A big reason for that was the influence of Mahatma Gandhi, the great Indian independence activist of the 20th century. Gandhi was a military veteran, and he thought in military terms. He actually said that his non-military efforts, his marches, his boycotts, his other activities, were a lot like military operations. And in fact, he said they were quite aggressive. He disliked the term passive resistance and said it was misleading and quite the opposite of what he was doing. He preached confrontational nonviolence, and the American Civil Rights Movement followed confrontational nonviolence quite religiously. The notion here is you come at your opponent again and again, but always non-violently. You don't just say, here, hit me on the head. You say, if you hit me on the head, I will be back tomorrow with somebody else. And we'll be back again 2 days from now with 3 times as many people and 4 times as many people next week. We will keep coming at you. There's a relentlessness in the civil rights movement that comes only from intense training and discipline. And those are a couple of things I want to focus on as I talk and get to your questions. Gandhi called this approach clinging to the truth, grasping the truth, holding on to it. Once you take that perspective, I think you can appreciate the achievements of the American Civil Rights Movement in new ways. I see this book as a tribute to the leaders and the rank and file of the civil rights movement, a recognition of their skills and their efforts, and most of all, of their extraordinary courage. If there's one summary I could give you, the nutshell to take away from this, is that there was nothing spontaneous about the civil rights movement. In fact, the demonstration of the march is probably the least important part of it. That's not an idea new to me. That comes from James Lawson, the great trainer of the civil rights movement in Nashville in the late 1950s and early 60s. He was a great trainer. He spent months preparing people for sit-in demonstrations. And he once said, a demonstration is the least of it. A demonstration comes at the end of months of work. And the test of a demonstration is not how big it is, but whether you can do it again tomorrow morning. So let me explain some of that. When I say that James Lawson trained people for months, I mean exactly that, intense, almost military-like training. It began by thinking about what type of people they needed to recruit. Not everybody could be a civil rights volunteer. They would turn people away and say, you know, you'd probably better serve the movement by staying here and babysitting some of the kids while the mothers and fathers are away demonstrating. Or perhaps you could be a runner taking messages to and from the demonstration. Other people, they made monitors of marches to take notes and be able to testify in court about what they saw and what time they saw it. The actual training in church basements across Nashville for the sit-in movement took place in weekly sessions where they would actually have role playing. A group of volunteers would sit at chairs pretending to be a lunch counter that was segregated, and they're there to demand service. Other trainees would punch them, push them, knock them off the chairs, pour coffee on them, perhaps even stub out a cigarette on them. Then they would switch, and the ones who had been the attackers now became the sit-in demonstrators, and they went through the same thing. What does this do? Well, the first thing it does is teach you to overcome that basic human instinct of fight or flight. If somebody attacks you, you either run away or you attack back. Civil rights was built on doing neither of those things. It was maintaining your dignity and your discipline, but not responding as expected, because you were not speaking the language of violence. You were speaking a new and different language that frequently flummoxed the white supremacist caste structure in the South. You were speaking the language of nonviolence. A concrete example, one of the things James Lawson taught his trainees, if somebody spits in your face, ask them for a handkerchief. One of the sit-in demonstrators actually did this in Nashville in the spring of 1960. Guy spit in his face. He said, "Sir, do you have a handkerchief?" And the attacker reached back in his pocket for a handkerchief. And then he realized what was happening. He said, "Hell no." But for a moment, there had been that human connection. Who were the trainees, the people they recruited? They are people who are American heroes, I think should be on postage stamps. They should be as well known as Civil War generals. One person I'm thinking of, Diane Nash. In 1960, Diane Nash was a 20-year-old college dropout living in a YWCA in Nashville. She wound up playing three-way political chess against both the segregationist governments of Alabama and Mississippi and the Kennedy administration, which early on, under President John Kennedy and Attorney General Robert Kennedy, was very ambivalent, was on the fence about civil rights. Later, they get off the fence. At one point, Attorney General Robert Kennedy turned to an aide and said, "Who the hell is Diane Nash?" The answer was this 20-year-old in Nashville who is a few steps ahead of you in the game. Another one of these heroes, Fred Shuttlesworth, not particularly into nonviolence. He believed in the use of violence in self-defense. He was a moonshiner turned minister in Birmingham, Alabama. He was bombed twice in his church and his home in the late 1950s. One day in early 1963, Birmingham was agog. They had heard that Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was coming to Birmingham to hold a civil rights campaign. And they called up Reverend Shuttlesworth, the white power structure, and said, "Can you come downtown for lunch?" He sat down and looked at them. They said, "We hear Martin Luther King Jr. is coming to town. How can we stop that?" Shuttlesworth looked them up and down and said, "You know, I was bombed twice, once in my bed. Not one of you called me then. But now you want to talk." Obviously, nothing could please Fred Shuttlesworth more than Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement coming to town to join him. The third person, another great trainer who should be better known, was an older woman named Septima Clark. Remembered now mainly because she was the person who trained and prepared Rosa Parks to participate, to begin the Montgomery bus boycott in 1956. She taught Rosa Parks a week-long course about how to think about nonviolent social change. She began it with one question: what do you want to do? She ended the week with another question: what are you going to do? In other words, she began by asking, what is your strategic goal? What do you want to do? She ended it with a tactical question: what are you going to do? How are you going to achieve that goal? Two other people who should be better known are Amzie Moore and Medgar Evers. Interestingly, both civil rights leaders who were veterans of World War II, of the Army in World War II, both in Mississippi, the hardest state. Like French resistance leaders in World War II, they persisted when there were manhunts going on for them. Amzie Moore and Medgar Evers were known as the people. If you were a young civil rights worker, go to them and they would teach you how to survive in Mississippi, which was a near totalitarian state where educating Black people about their rights was literally forbidden. These are people who survived for decades, unlike the French resistance, which was just a handful of years, for decades in Mississippi, Alabama, and similar places. Another extraordinary leader is Bob Moses. He was a very quiet leader of Freedom Summer. And then there's James Bevel. Bevel intrigues me a lot. He was the strategic thinker for Martin Luther King. He was a man who said that you have to go through some chaos to have social change. A good example of this is Bevel was once invited to give a sermon in a small church in rural Georgia, rural southern Georgia, this little wooden church, a Black congregation. And he's the guest minister standing in the pulpit giving his sermon. In the middle of it, the local county sheriff walks in to the church and stands in the back, puffing on a cigar. How disrespectful. Smoking in church, smoking a cigar during the sermon. Bevel doesn't miss a beat. James Bevel looks around the church and he says, now the good thing about the devil is he'll always give you a signal about who he is. Sometimes he has a little forked tail. Sometimes he carries a pitchfork. And sometimes he just stands there puffing on a cigar. When he said that, the church broke out in laughter. Now think of this. The white sheriff is a figure of fear in the white supremacist South. And Bevel has the church laugh at him. At that moment, this is the chaos that Bevel liked. He turns, the structure upside down. It's harder to be afraid of someone you have just laughed at. Now, the sheriff understood that. He needed to reassert his power. And that night, the church was burned. Bevel explained, I didn't make him burn the church. He burned it in order to show where power is. What we did was show you the violence inherent in the system. And it's true. Slavery was built on violence. For example, a runaway slave frequently was punished by having his or her all their toes cut off. That violence persisted after the end of slavery with the imposition of Jim Crow, which basically was slavery with even fewer protections because there was no owner to protect you. A lot of books will tell you what the civil rights movement did. In this book, what I try to do is tell you how they did it. The theme of this book, this military perspective, is that the civil rights movement was extraordinarily well organized. It was well prepared. It was focused. At each step of the way, they took the necessary steps to achieve their goals, and very specific ones. As I said earlier, talking about Nashville, first they recruited, then they trained, sometimes for months. They developed tactics and strategy that would carry out their goal of nonviolent change nonviolently. They sometimes escalated. They sometimes adapted their tactics. And much like a war, they changed. Again and again, though, what they tried to do that's different from a military is they tried to take a negative energy and turn it into a positive energy. So, for example, if they burn a bus you're riding on, you show up again the next day and do it again, showing great courage. There were people in the Freedom Rides who were burned off of a bus, beaten when they got off the bus, who got on another bus the next week. This is Mississippi and Alabama and Georgia in 1961. Each major campaign in the civil rights movement from 55 to 68, I think, demonstrates a basic military principle or operation. And I'm going to run through those briefly. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 is usually just called the boycott. What it was, effectively, was a siege of a city in which a large proportion of the population withdraws patronage from the city's transportation system. With this intense organization, backed up by the city's Black churches, they were able to demonstrate a cohesive power that persisted for over a year, challenged the power structure of the city, and then changed it fundamentally. Nashville, 1960, I've mentioned a couple of times, the sit-ins. It really shows the importance of training and preparation, the role playing, the taking hits, how to be attacked and overcome that impulse to fight or flee. They also thought deeply and morally about strategy, which is important because I don't think that Americans generally do strategy well, and I don't think the American military does strategy well. The civil rights movement did it much better. By that, I mean the American military is tactically very good. They can go in and fight very well. But if you're fighting in Afghanistan for 20 years, that's to me evidence that you don't have a strategy. You shouldn't be mucking around in some place for 20 years and then leave it without fundamentally changing the place. The civil rights movement made strategy almost simple. They began with a basic question: who are we and what are we trying to do? Diane Nash's definition, which I think is important, is this: we are people who will no longer live with segregation. Well, what does that mean? That means, she said, yeah, we know people are going to try to kill us for our refusal to live with segregation, but we see that as their problem, not our problem. We just don't recognize segregation. We don't live with it. Now, they may kill us, but we're not going back. The Freedom Rides, 1961, this was riding buses across the South after the federal government had said that interstate travel, that is by buses or airplanes, could not be segregated. The federal government was not enforcing this, and the law was not obeyed. In the South, there were still only whites only and blacks only segregated waiting rooms, segregation seated on the buses and so on. The participants showed great courage. They also illustrated how to respond to attacks. They didn't turn to violence. They kept going. They kept the enemy off balance. When Bull Connor, the brutal police chief in Birmingham, Alabama, took a bunch of freedom riders and drove them personally to the state border. They got out and then they got in another car and raced him back to Birmingham. This was not what Bull Connor was used to from people that he tried to kick out of town. Birmingham, spring of 1963, almost the Gettysburg of the civil rights movement, a key battle that won national attention. Birmingham was important because at first the campaign began poorly. Birmingham's Black adults did not want to march. They knew how totalitarian the city could be. They knew that the Birmingham police routinely killed Black people without an investigation following. And they didn't want to lose their jobs. And one thing that happened in the South is if you marched for civil rights the next day, people often were fired from their jobs. So James Bevel decided, I know what we'll do. We'll have kids march. Kids can't be fired from their jobs, yet it still imposes a cost on the city. They filled the Birmingham's jails with children, some of them as young as 8 years old. And Bull Connor, the police chief, responded by turning fire hoses and police dogs on these children. That was not much different from the way Bull Connor had acted in the past. What was different was this time it was on national television. Now, the South had always told the rest of America, don't worry, we know how to handle Black people. We know them, we grew up with them. Let us handle it. What America saw on television in Birmingham in the spring of 1963 was that's how they handle it. That if children go out and demonstrate, they are hit with fire hoses so powerful that if the flow of the hose touches your hair, it rips it out. This hoses would knock the bark off of trees when they hit the trees. They would roll the kids down the street like bowling balls. And of course, there were police dogs. The rest of America said, if that's the way you do it, we don't like it. We want it to stop. Martin Luther King then has the brilliant notion, okay, we just introduced ourselves to America on television. Let's go to Washington now and hold the biggest march in American history, the biggest interracial action of any kind ever in America. And let's tell the nation who we are and what we're about. And they do the March on Washington. What's the military principle here? The military principle is logistics. Logistics is the movement of people, goods, and things to the right place at the right time. It was a brilliant operation. 250,000 Americans were moved into Washington, demonstrated for a day, and then moved out. Not a single arrest occurred. There was no violence. One reason was, and all the details, all the thinking here is so crucial. They said, we don't want the DC police to try to protect this march because they've got a kind of nasty reputation then. We told them to look outward, prevent the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, from attacking us. They brought in Black policemen from around the country to be monitors at the demonstration. And again, as I said, not one arrest and everybody out of town by sunset. Before the March on Washington, August 1963, America really had not paid that much attention. Martin Luther King's speeches were not routinely covered by the white media. His speech that day, the I Have a Dream speech, was covered. And in it, he says, hey, America, this is who we are. He says, you've seen Bull Connor's nightmare vision, the police dogs, the fire hoses. This is our vision of living in America as equal citizens. We have a dream. And which do you pick, America, the dream or the nightmare? America said, we're going to choose the dream. Freedom Summer, 1964, Mississippi. This is as close as we come to a conventional ground campaign, a conventional war. Basically, the civil rights movement invaded the state, not led by Martin Luther King's organization, the SCLC, but by a younger, more radical student-run organization, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, also known as SNCC. They brought in not just their local civil rights people, but over 1,000 white kids, mainly children of privilege, Ivy League kids, the sons and daughters of TV network executives and congressmen. And the message to America was, if you won't pay attention to Black people being attacked every day in Mississippi, maybe you'll pay attention when your own children are attacked. And they were attacked all summer long. Civil rights workers were bombed, beaten, burned, and blown up. 3 civil rights workers were beaten, shot, and buried in an earthen dam. At the time, the civil rights movement wasn't sure what it achieved. I think with the passage of 7 decades since then, or 7 decades, 6 decades, what you see is the enormous achievement of Freedom Summer. Before Freedom Summer, only 7% of Mississippi's Black adults were allowed to vote. By 1968, the next presidential election year after that, 69% of Mississippi's Black adults were registered. One interesting example here, in 1969, a young Black man in Mississippi named Benny Thompson ran for office for the first time, was elected to a local office in his little town west of Jackson. Later, he was elected mayor of that little town. Later, he moved on to Congress. And over the last year, he was the chair of the January 6th committee investigating the invasion of the Capitol building on January 6th, 2 years ago. So what you have is Freedom Summer tries to establish democracy in Mississippi for the first time. As a result of that process, we have the chairman of a committee trying to protect American democracy, who is elected partly as a result of the Freedom Summer operations. Finally, Selma, 1965. This is more familiar to people, partly because there've been a couple of good movies made about it. Selma is like the World War I of the movement. The civil rights movement is powerful, it's seasoned, it knows what it's doing, and it conducts a frontal assault against state segregation in Alabama. It is way ahead of the state government. It knows what it's doing. And it eventually marches from Selma to Montgomery and peaceably shuts down the capital of Alabama, which had been the capital of the Confederacy. It was a brilliant campaign and incredibly effective. After that comes what I think of as the sad campaigns: Chicago, 66, Memphis, 68. Martin Luther King is tired, he plods on, he doesn't see an alternative, and he is killed. But before he was killed, he achieved great things. To end, and to get to your questions, I want to say I loved writing this book. I found it inspiring. I think partly because of that, it is the best written of my books. My other books, many of them were difficult to write. They were about difficult, sad subjects like the war in Iraq. This was about admirable people working courageously to make America a better place and to make it, I think, for the first time, much more of a democracy than it had ever been. I have some hope for today. I'm a little bit surprised at where this country is now, given the achievements of the civil rights movement. I think there's been a lot of backsliding, and I think we're seeing a resurgence of white supremacism in this country. I think we still have a long way to go, but I would say that there's a lot we can take away from the civil rights movement about the way forward. Operate with dignity, with discipline, with a lot of strategic forethought, and you can succeed in this country. To me, that is the big lesson of the civil rights movement. And now I'd love to turn to your questions. Thank you very much.
So Tom, thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. And I hope everyone here is, ordering Tom's book wherever it's sold, right? And going and getting a copy, because it's an interesting take on a familiar topic to a lot of us. So my question for you is, so you wrote a book about the war in Iraq. I read your last book about how the Greeks and the Romans inspired the founding fathers, and now you're out with a book about the civil rights movement. How do you pick these topics, and how is your research process, and how it's just such a disparate, a wide array of topics that I'm curious how you pick them and how you go about writing these books.
Thank you. They all kind of grow out of the same thing, a question about who are we as a nation, where are we going, how did we get here? I think of my last three books as a kind of trilogy. Churchill and Orwell is about two Englishmen in the mid-20th century, one on the left, one on the right, who say, what do we do about totalitarianism from the left to the right? What do we do about communism and fascism, anti-democratic movements? How do we defend democracy? What struck me is their answers were very similar. You defend individual rights. You defend freedom of thought. And when you see that being violated on your own side, you point it out. To the point at which Churchill, a dedicated conservative, a very small c conservative man, at one point said that if the conservatives kept up in the direction they were going, he would campaign on the socialist platform in I think he said it was 40 or 41. So Church and Orwell looks at that, how these two guys thought about preserving democracy in their own time. And then the next book, First Principles, really was inspired by the election of Donald Trump. In 2016, when I woke up, I said, wait a second, what just happened? I didn't expect this. And literally, I went to First Principles. I went down that Wednesday morning after the presidential election and took down my old college copy of Aristotle's Politics and began rereading it with an eye to understanding Trump. And it really helped me. Among other things, he says, oligarchy is the least stable form of government. And I think America is increasingly becoming an oligarchy. And Trump is a good example of that. Oligarchy is a state run for the benefit of a few rich people. And it's another point, Aristotle says the least stable form of government is an oligarchy supported by the mob. And I thought, well, wow, that's kind of Trump's basic equation, an oligarchy supported by mob power, as we saw on January 6th. So that led me to a wonderful multi-year excursion through the classical authors who had influenced America's founding generation. I wasn't just saying, what are the great classics out there? I was specifically saying, what did they read? What editions did they read? And I tried to read the exact editions that they read, to the point at which one day I was reading a book and I knew John Adams had read. And when I finished it, I was getting my source notes together. I looked in the front, and the copy I was reading online actually had been John Adams' copy, signed by him. And it was the copy that had been digitized down in Boston by a historical society there. So I sort of felt like I was sitting there reading with John Adams. And then this book, again, says, where are we? How did we get here? And especially this book says, what can we do about it? Much more than my other two books, this is a book that says, there's a good blueprint for how to operate in this society to bring about radical social change. And the amazing thing is, because America is a pretty violent country, it is built on non-violence. Why does it work? Because the American system speaks violence fluently. What it doesn't speak, and especially in its authoritarian aspects, is non-violent social change. And as James Bevel observed, once you go non-violent, you're always one step ahead of the opposition, especially if you are committed to the death. Before you could go on the freedom rides, Bevel, who was sort of the screener for this, demanded that each person give him a written last will and testament, and then said, explain to me why you're going, because if I can't explain to your parents why you were killed, you're not getting on the bus. So once you commit yourself to nonviolence up to the point of death, you are so far ahead of the game in America that if you think through strategy carefully, you can do amazing things. One of these really surprises to me, and a great pleasant surprise, was the civil rights movement spent literally hours and days in meetings discussing those strategic questions. Who are we? What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? And they kept great records, especially SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So it was like I was sitting there in this meeting room in Atlanta where they're having intense discussions, sometimes yelling at each other about who are we, what are we going to do, and what's the right way to do it. Because as Casey Hayden, one of the members of SNCC, said, if you're asking people to put their lives on the line, you have to hear them out. So going on this journey with the civil rights movement actually made me feel better about this country in a time when I'm very concerned about this country.
So a question from the audience, and please, if anybody has a question, please put them in the chat either here on Zoom or on Facebook. A question from Christian Coates, First Amendment Museum CEO. Thank you, Christian. But when you were researching this era, were you able to interview people from this time period, from the civil rights movement?
I did a few interviews. I did more interviews also with children of civil rights people, partly to get their own memories, partly because I was looking for certain documents, diaries, memoirs that people had written that hadn't been published, and so on. What I found, though, was that the records were so prolific and online and digitized that I literally could spend well over a year just going through archival transcripts of meetings. One of the things I loved was the civil rights movement managed early on to get access to what was called Watts lines back then, wide area telephone system, which was marvelous. Basically, you could make long distance phone calls for free. So one thing they'd do is in each demonstration, they'd have observers in telephone booths watching the demonstration, noting the time and calling back everything they were seeing to someone sitting in Atlanta typing up. And so at Selma, there's this one guy standing in the phone booth as the marchers are going off over the Edmund Pettus Bridge and marching into a phalanx of state troopers and posse men on horses, carrying rubber truncheons wrapped in barbed wire that they're about to bring down on the heads of the marchers, firing tear gas. And this guy is narrating it as he's watching it. And it's stunning. It's like, he said, whoa, oh, here's an ambulance. Oh, they're firing tear gas. It's like a war here. And it's just the intensity of it comes through. So that's really what I found the most profound of the interactions, was not the interviews I did, though some were memorable, but really those transcripts of events, those documents of the time, especially when I brought a new military perspective. I'm asking, what did you do for recruiting? What did you do for training? These were things that concerned them a lot, but that interviewers and journalists generally didn't ask them about.
So when we think about organizing demonstrations and social justice movements, what is the difference between good military planning and good civilian planning? And how is planning for a military operation different than, say, planning for a business or something like that? And how did these military principles impact civil rights movement planning and organization?
There's a lot of similarities between military planning and corporate planning and social change planning. The biggest difference is the consequences. If a corporation makes a plan and it doesn't work and everything falls apart, you file for Chapter 11 and you go home. If you go do a demonstration and you get your head cracked, there better be somebody there to take care of your cracked head. And that's what the military is like. There's a lot of second, third, fourth order consequences. If you have a demonstration, are you going to have an ambulance there? Are you going to have trained medical workers present? The civil rights movement did. If you're going to do a demonstration today, are you going to be able to do it tomorrow? Remember James Lawson's great test. The test of a demonstration is not its size, it's whether you can do it again tomorrow. Can you continue this very aggressive but nonviolent form of confrontation? These are all things that are much more like military operations than they are like going to an office, making a few phone calls, trying to borrow some money and get your corporation up and running. I'm going to say, though, just the imagination they brought to it. This goes to the First Amendment Center mission. I didn't talk about the Freedom Schools, which is a big part of Freedom Summer. There are two legs to Freedom Summer. One was trying to register Black people to vote in Mississippi with great violent resistance. The other was to educate Black students. Both youth and adults wanted education. One of the things they did, and the Freedom Schools were very successful. They had expected a few thousand people, and instead they were overwhelmed. Tens of thousands of people were interested. One of the things they did in one school was they read the Declaration of Independence, and then the students wrote their own Declaration of Independence from the state of Mississippi. Their grievances were similar to Thomas Jefferson's in the Declaration of Independence, except that instead of talking about the abuses of the king, they said, why is it that in the white part of town, the streets are paved, but in the Black part of town, they're not? Why is it? These kids drew up their Declaration of Independence from the state of Alabama, listing their grievances and saying, these are the changes we want to see in this state, which strikes me as a great teaching method to say, you can do this too, what the founders did. It's not quite directly related to what you were asking about planning, but it is an instance of using great imagination and in approaching how to bring about social change.
So compared to some of the other books that you've written, Tom, was this one, I know you and I were talking at some point earlier, and I know I think you enjoyed working on this book more than you have other books. Can you talk about that process a little bit?
Sure. I just found that this was such a great story. It had been told in a variety of ways, but to me, it's like a modern American Civil War with all the drama and emotion that you have in the Civil War from the early battles, on to Gettysburg and Vicksburg and so on. And I thought the story could be told that way, and that the military perspective enabled me to focus on some of the more interesting but obscure things like logistics and training and recruiting. Training is incredibly important in the military, but it doesn't get much attention. You'll never see a dramatic movie about training. Any movie about training is by nature a comedy, like Stars and Stripes, that old Bill Murray movie and so on. But training is incredibly important. And I wanted to write about that in a serious way. So this perspective, this framework, the military framework, I think made it particularly interesting to me and a lot of fun to go through and say, there is a great story to be told here, and I'd like to tell Americans it. The surprise to me has been, this book has been a critical success. People who read it seem to love it. It has 5 stars from every reader on Amazon has looked at it. Yet it is not sold as well as my other books.
Interesting.
And I don't know quite why that is. Are people just not interested in the civil rights movement? Do people think they know it, the whole story already? Maybe. I don't know. But I'm glad I wrote the book. You're right. The only reason to write a book is because you really have to get it out of your head. So I wrote this book. I'm glad I did. Yet I'm constantly surprised that America has kind of looked and said, we're not reading that right now.
Well, you never know. Give America a chance. It was a hard winter at Barnes and Noble, I heard.
Well, it's interesting. Yesterday, a woman who's an expert in nonviolence was interviewing me, and she said, "Oh, this book is a classic of the genre of nonviolence. This will be read for decades." And
Wow.
she said, "Don't worry about it. It's just going to be out there. Anybody who wants to understand nonviolence in America is going to read this book and Erica Chenoweth's book about nonviolence."
Right. Do you think that the modern social justice movement and groups can learn something from the civil rights movement of that era? There's a lot of criticism out there about the movement now being very fractured. So do you think there's a lesson to be learned there, or to reflect back on by the groups today?
It's not for me to speak for them, but from what I've read, the modern social justice movements like Black Lives Matter actually have learned quite a lot from the classical civil rights movement. In fact, one of the things that's striking to me is early on, a leader of Black Lives Matter went to James Lawson in Nashville and asked for advice. And that was the advice he gave her, which is, it's not the size of your demonstration, it's whether you can do it again tomorrow. That's the key to pay attention to. Bob Moses, who I mentioned, actually went to a major Black Lives Matter meeting. He died a couple of years later, but went to one. So there actually are interesting connections there. One of the big differences is that the modern social justice movement is wary of putting leaders out there. They don't seem to want to put a face on the movement. And I think one of the reasons is that civil rights leaders got killed in this country. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, Medgar Evers, and people who had a militaristic image, the Black Panthers, were attacked with great violence. I think one of the untold stories in this country is the US government's war against the Black Panthers, in which at least 40, perhaps 50 Black Panthers were killed violently by police forces in a 3-year period in the late 1960s.
Okay, last question. What's next?
For America or for me?
For you, for you. God knows what's next for America. What's next for you?
Well, first I gotta say, I am so glad your center is there.
Thank you.
Boy, do we need institutions that speak up for the constitutional principles and values that made this country. At a time when a lot of people don't seem to understand them or care about them. And I've been reading a book lately about problems overseas in the observance of human rights. And one of the problems is lack of institutions, experts and authorities that you can turn to, you can rely on, people who speak up for these things, not as individuals, but also as groups who monitor the observance of human rights in the country and point out, oh, you know, that's historically not what we do in this country, or that's actually illegal what you're arguing for, something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know what's next for me. I love writing fiction. I just can't find anybody who wants to read it. My nonfiction tends to be very popular, and I've made a good living from it. But I also have a kind of, with my left hand, written some fiction. I published one novel once. And I'm kind of toying with writing some fiction now.
Well, as a great lover of historical fiction, I would say go for it.
Well, thank you. Maybe you can publish it.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're getting about 6 or 8 inches of snow tonight, depending on where you are in Maine, and it's just started to come down. That's probably why Max had to bail. But it was great seeing you. I'm sure it's not snowing in Austin, and we'll look forward to seeing you this spring when you get back to Maine.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me tonight.
Thanks, Tom. Take care.
Bye-bye.